Hello everyone. This evening, we're entering the resonant stone hallways of a fortress from medieval times. Flames dance along the surfaces, and you can practically sense the subtle whistle of air slipping through gaps in the massive timber entrances. It's the sort of environment that appears enchanting when you're there as a sightseer. But if you actually had to reside here, particularly during a frigid evening, you'd likely have regrets before 60 minutes elapsed. The truth is straightforward. Fortresses were absolutely freezing. And if you needed to rest inside one lacking modern heating, protected glass, or even a reasonable sleeping surface by contemporary measures, you'd quickly realize that your primary adversary wasn't opposing warriors. It was the bitter temperature. You'll probably not make it through this. At minimum, not without several strategies. So before you settle in, pause to appreciate the content and follow along, though only if you truly value what's presented here. And if you're tuned in currently, share your whereabouts and what hour it is where you are. I enjoy discovering where across the globe listeners are joining from. Now, lower the illumination, allow your respiration to ease, and envision yourself getting ready for rest in a medieval stronghold. You walk across the stone flooring of an expansive room, footwear grinding against areas polished by generations of passage. The frigid air stings your flesh, despite being completely clothed. The stone barriers don't merely resist heat, they consume it entirely. Historians frequently characterize castles as achievements of protection, though seldom as achievements of ease. And here's the harsh reality. Those identical massive barriers that could deflect a siege engine also imprisoned cold atmosphere like an enormous icebox. Once daylight disappeared, the interior temperature dropped nearly as rapidly as the exterior. You'd observe your exhalations, creating vapor ahead of your face. The atmosphere inside seems thick, moist, and inhospitable. Fortresses were constructed to prevent adversaries from entering, not to prevent the freeze from settling in. The builders considered moats, pulleys, narrow openings, but thermal protection wasn't truly in their designs. A widely known fact deserving mention is that numerous fortresses in Northern Europe were deliberately positioned on windswept elevations. From a tactical perspective, that was ingenious. You could observe invaders approaching, and the inclines provided you a protective benefit. But from the viewpoint of someone attempting to obtain rest, it was a nightmare. Wind battered every surface and drove icy currents through openings in coverings and beneath entrances. You couldn't request a more terrible sleeping environment if you attempted. You might assume the fireplaces would rescue you, but no. Even a roaring blaze in the central chamber scarcely heated the direct area surrounding it. And the farther you stepped from the fire, the more frigid it turned, until it seemed more like a cellar than a residential area. By the time you moved toward your sleeping quarters, the temperature could seem closer to a storage space than a living chamber. Now, here's an interesting morsel. In certain documents from the latter medieval era, visitors documented the astonishment of ice developing inside the sleeping rooms of fortresses. Envision awakening with frozen formations suspended from your sleeping enclosure, or finding the cleaning bowl solidified completely. Writers addressed this as nearly ordinary, not deserving more than a casual reference. If your quarters didn't develop a thin coating of frozen moisture on the barriers in January, it indicated you were in the fortunate few. And yet, in spite of this, individuals survived. Somehow, they discovered methods to prevent their bodies from becoming frozen solid. Part of that survival awareness involved ceremony. As darkness descended, complete households pursued patterns designed to capture whatever heat they could. The fortress might be enormous, but the emphasis was always on reducing the living area at nighttime. Blazes were contained, Sleeping surfaces were positioned with draperies. Garments were stacked until movement was a lesser worry, and everyone hoped the current wouldn't be too harsh. You envision yourself entering a medieval sleeping chamber. The sleeping surface itself is a remarkable piece of woodwork, elevated well above the ground. That wasn't for appearance. It was a tactic to avoid the most frigid stratum of atmosphere, which perpetually descends. Even so, the stone radiates freeze upward, and your body senses it the instant you ascend beneath the coverings. Historians continue debating whether fortresses genuinely became more pleasant as generations advanced, or whether the legends of comfortable, aristocratic existence were inflated by subsequent narrators. Some propose that wall hangings and substantial draperies genuinely converted rooms into heated areas, while others maintain that the cold perpetually prevailed. Regardless of how much material you suspended on the barriers, the reality likely exists in the center. Conditions enhanced moderately, but never to the standard of genuine ease. You recline in this envisioned sleeping surface, the timber structure groaning as straw-filled bedding shifts beneath you. Beyond, the wind wails against the fortifications. The sole illumination is from a small oil vessel flickering near the bedside, and even that seems like it battles to remain burning. Your toes already start to throb with the piercing cold, despite the fact you're still wrapped in your daytime garments. And then the acoustics of a fortress evening drift in, the far echo of boots on stone as a sentry switches position, the groan of beams under ice. A canine barking distantly in the courtyard, its sound dampened by the density of the barriers. You might even detect the trickle of liquid freezing somewhere close by. None of it assists you in feeling heated. Instead, it reminds you that the environment outside is merciless. It's appealing to picture the aristocracy nestled in perfect ease while commoners froze in their dwellings. But here's the amusing thing. Sometimes the commoners had it superior. Their residences, constructed of timber and clay, might capture heat from the cooking fire more effectively than the enormous cavernous chambers of a lord's tower. A solitary blaze in a modest shelter could maintain a complete family reasonably warm. Meanwhile, you, an aristocrat in a fortress, could shiver in a stone container so large that even 5 blazing fireplaces wouldn't create an impact. That contradiction wasn't overlooked by contemporaries. A few remaining letters from religious figures and aristocratic visitors comment on the challenge of obtaining peaceful rest in fortresses during the winter. They characterize the sleeping surfaces as magnificent, but the evenings as severe. Some even recommend travelers to bring additional wraps, not for display, but for continuation. As you proceed, picturing yourself positioned there, you start to value the cleverness it must have required just to survive the evening. You didn't merely crawl beneath a covering and hope for the optimal. You stacked materials, accumulated animal skins, drew draperies secure, and sometimes even distributed your sleeping surface with associates, human or alternatively. Every action was about generating small climates, little areas of heat in an environment constructed by nature and building design to be continuously cold. The encounter reshapes how you consider medieval existence. These individuals weren't merely fighters and rulers, religious figures and ladies. They were survivalists. Every sleeping hour was an examination, every winter a challenge, and rest, which we now regard an effortless privilege, had to be constructed carefully with ceremonies transferred down across generations. Envision how appreciative you'd sense for every glimmer of heat, the unexpected ease of a canine pressed against your lower limbs, the excitement of heated stones positioned near your bedding, the minor triumph of preventing ice off your facial hair through the evening. These instances would remain with you far more clearly than any banquet or pursuit. Continuation was unforgettable. So this evening, as you rest in your contemporary sleeping surface, with your modern heating humming quietly, you can dedicate a consideration for those who once rested, shivering in stone chambers. Their evenings were extended, their mornings severe, and yet they persisted. They discovered a method to rest in locations that should have been uninhabitable. That cleverness is what we'll proceed to investigate stratum by stratum, strategy by strategy, as this narrative transports you further into the medieval darkness. But before we advance deeper into the cold, pause here for a moment, because the approach to sleeping surface in a medieval fortress was itself a ceremony, a sequence of actions performed with deliberate intention, not unlike a ritual designed to ease the body into the difficult passage ahead. Envision the final light of a winter afternoon vanishing behind the battlements. The bells for vespers toll from the fortress chapel, their deep resonance traveling through stone and timber. Attendants begin the slow work of shutting things down, banking the fires in lesser chambers, collecting vessels from the central chamber, carrying heated bricks wrapped in linen toward the sleeping quarters. There is an order to all of it. Someone extinguishes the lesser torches, leaving the corridors lit only at their corners. Someone else begins folding away the tablecloths, shaking breadcrumbs onto the rushes for the canines. The fortress breathes differently at this hour, like a great creature settling its weight. For the lord or lady of the chamber, undressing was not a solitary act. Attendants assisted with every lace and buckle, removed outer robes and folded them, offered a cloth dampened with cold water to wash the face and hands. The gesture was brief but deliberate, a ritual boundary between the waking world and sleep. Some households observed a final prayer at the bedside. A chaplain or the inhabitant themselves would speak a few lines, commending the soul to safety before darkness claimed it. The prayer was sincere. Mornings were not guaranteed. Winter especially had a way of taking the vulnerable in the small cold hours before dawn. Medical advisors of the era recommended additional preparations. Some recommended a brief walk through the corridors after supper, not for pleasure, but to encourage the body's inner warmth to circulate. Others suggested rubbing oil of lavender into the temples or placing a small sachet of dried herbs beneath the pillow, thyme, chamomile, or vervain, each believed to ease the spirits toward gentle slumber. Whether these remedies possessed any power beyond comfort, no one could say. But the very existence of them reveals something important. Medieval individuals thought carefully about sleep. They considered it fragile, earned, and worthy of preparation. Rest was not something you stumbled into. It was something you built toward, step by step, through the last deliberate ceremonies of the day. You advance into the central chamber now, the pulsing core of any medieval fortress. If the sleeping quarters was a crypt of stone and currents, this location is at minimum alive with glimmers of heat. Extended wooden tables extend across the ground, their timber areas polished by innumerable elbows and vessels. The atmosphere carries the aroma of cooked flesh, spilled brew, moist wool, and vapor that never completely departs the ceiling beams. The blaze in the main hearth roars intensely, a resistant square of orange heat against the advancing winter obscurity. This is where the fortress felt most animated after dusk. Individuals assembled here not solely for nourishment, but also to absorb as much heat as achievable before withdrawing to their frozen chambers. Attendants rush back and forth transporting bread portions, containers of brew, and enormous platters of steaming thick soup. Canines scavenge beneath, tails moving, anticipating for remnants. The chamber is noisy, nearly raucous with amusement, melody, and the rattling of blades against dishes. For a brief period, you disregard that beyond the wind screams across the fortifications, and ice is developing on the glass openings. Here's the straightforward fact. The central chamber was the sole area in most fortresses where heating was even distantly successful. An enormous open hearth controlled the center or conclusion of the space, and the blaze was nourished nearly perpetually in winter. Timber, sometimes complete tree sections, were transported in to maintain it burning. If you possessed rank, you secured a position near it, warming in that golden radiance, while attendants or less privileged souls shivered along the boundaries. But here's the difficulty. Even in this magnificent space, the heat solely traveled a certain distance. The farther you positioned from the flames, the more frigid the atmosphere turned, until it seemed as though the barriers themselves exhaled out ice. Heat ascended upward, captured in the vapor-stained ceiling beams, while those on the ground wrapped themselves in wraps and pressed together. In reality, solely a fortunate minority were ever heated, and everyone else pretended to be. One interesting detail that writers reference is that celebrations sometimes doubled as tactical heating sessions. Aristocracies scheduled their grandest assemblies during the severe months, understanding that the body heat of hundreds of visitors combined with the blaze would transform the central chamber into something approaching comfortable. In certain accounts, it's even stated that attendants were instructed to position closer together merely to produce additional heat. You could state that feasting was as much about continuation as it was about celebration, but the radiance of the chamber didn't persist. When the celebration concluded, the musicians packed away their tools, and the visitors staggered off to their sleeping services. The blaze was ultimately permitted to burn minimal. Coals radiated crimson, a final position against the cold, and darkness developed extended on the stone barriers. That heat you adhered to during the evening dissipated rapidly. Within an hour or two, the central chamber itself would descend back into severe silence. Envision yourself presently, hesitating by the blaze, reluctant to depart, extending your palms to soak up every final spark of heat. Your face radiates warmth, but the reverse of your body already senses the cold advancing in, reminding you of what awaits upstairs. The vapor stings your vision and adheres to your hair, but you still fear the instant when you must ascend the spiral stairway to your quarters. Historians continue debating whether certain fortresses developed more advanced heating arrangements for their central chambers. A few contend that vents and channels permitted the heat to move, particularly in subsequent centuries. Others propose this is hopeful speculation, indicating that medieval construction technology merely didn't emphasize ease. The agreement leans toward the harsher reality. The central chamber was heated solely in the direct proximity of the blaze, and nowhere else. Even the acoustics reminded you that this wasn't a snug lodge, but a cavernous chamber of authority. Every chuckle reverberated, every footfall magnified until the soundscape itself appeared too expansive, too frigid. And when the chamber cleared, the quietness became crushing, like sitting in the belly of a resting giant. One of the most revealing images is the shift itself, the journey from the central chamber to your sleeping quarters. Envision departing the golden fire illumination, advancing into a confined passage illuminated by a solitary torch. The current strikes you instantly, a blade of frigid atmosphere rushing through narrow openings and unsealed doorways. Your exhalation fogs again. The heat you just transported in your bones drains away as though the fortress itself is consuming it. That transition from one space of temporary ease to the perpetual freeze beyond, characterized medieval evenings. Sometimes, aristocrats lingered so extensively in the central chamber that they practically rested there. A tall-backed bench drawn close to the hearth could function as a temporary sleeping surface, and attendants or sentries frequently collapsed near the coals, rather than confront their quarters. To rest near the blaze was to risk sparks, vapor, and disturbed noise, but compared to the frozen stone above, it was still appealing. Another interesting observation from the documents: travelers frequently complained more about the passage from the central chamber to the sleeping areas than the rest itself. That brief exposure, shifting from heat into cold, was characterized as an impact to the body. Individuals spoke of tremors lasting all evening because of that journey. It's as if the fortress itself punished you for daring to think you might be pleasant. The diminishing radiance of the chamber was psychological too. You understood that once you abandoned it behind, the evening would be extended and pitiless. The central chamber was not merely a space. It was a ceremony, an assembly of heat before surrendering to the cold. Every torch extinguished, every cup emptied, was another advance toward a shivering ordeal in sleeping service. Even in the glimmer of candle illumination, you perceive how temporary ease truly was. The blaze that once roared now murmurs faintly, sparks popping and perishing. An attendant pokes at it half-heartedly, then abandons, leaving the coals to diminish. The sound of amusement and feasting is gone, replaced by the quiet groans of the fortress settling into the darkness. And so you rotate reluctantly to ascend that stairway, wrap secured tightly around you, the recollection of heat fading with each advance. The radiance of the central chamber persists in your mind like a vision you wish could persist. But already your toes numb, your fingers sting, and you comprehend the remainder of the evening will be a battle for heat. That transient radiance is what maintained individuals rational. The ceremony of assembling, feasting, and warming in fire illumination before the cold reclaimed its domain. Without the central chamber, the fortress would have been intolerable. With it, individuals at minimum had an opportunity to recall what heat felt like, if solely for a few hours. But there was something else that happened in those final hours in the Great Hall, something that rarely appears in lists of heating strategies, yet may have mattered as much as any blaze or covering. Before the musicians set down their instruments and the last visitor stumbled toward the stairway, there were stories. A harpist or a lute player occupied a corner bench, their melody weaving through the aroma of vapor and roasted flesh. The music did not cease abruptly when supper ended. It softened gradually, becoming quieter, slower, as though the notes themselves understood that the hour had arrived for transition. Ballads gave way to slower airs, their rhythms unhurried, pulling the listener downward toward ease. Alongside the music came the stories. A steward or a traveling minstrel might recite a tale of distant kingdoms, of noble deeds, of creatures from the forests beyond the valley. These were not merely entertainment. They were a form of collective unwinding. Individuals who had spent the day in labor or in the management of a complex household needed something to release the tension of wakefulness before they could submit to rest. Written accounts from monastic communities describe a similar practice. The reader appointed for the evening would recite from scripture or from a saint's life, while the brothers consumed in deliberate silence. The voice became a kind of current, carrying the mind away from the day's concerns towards something larger and calmer. Even in secular households, contemporaries noted that certain lords requested quiet reading aloud after supper, specifically to calm the humors. A physician's manual from the 13th century advises against rousing conversation before sleeping surface, recommending instead that one listen to harmonious sounds, for these drive the blood gently inward and prepare the body for its necessary rest. Envision yourself there in the fading light, a cup cooling between your palms, the harpist's final melody dissolving into the rafters. The fire is low now, its crackle barely audible. Around you, heads begin to dip. The hall that roared an hour ago breathes only in whispers. This, too, was survival, not of the body, but of the spirit, the music, the story, the quiet last cup before the cold corridor waited. Each of these was a small mercy, a bridge between the difficulty of the day and the long frozen passage of the night. You ascend higher into the tower presently, away from the diminishing radiance of the central chamber, and the atmosphere changes instantly. The heat of the blaze is vanished, replaced by a moist cold that adheres to your bones. The barriers are substantial, more substantial than anything you've witnessed in contemporary houses. Sometimes 12 feet of stone dividing you from the exterior environment. Initially, that sounds like safeguarding. But here's the contradiction. Those identical barriers that halted projectiles and siege apparatus also captured the freeze inside. If you've ever advanced into a basement in winter, you understand the feeling. The stone maintains the temperature like a recollection, radiating cold even when the exterior atmosphere heats briefly. Medieval constructors comprehended strength and permanence, but not ease. And so the barriers became contradictory, strongholds against warriors, but not against the climate. One fact historians concur on is that fortresses seldom heated beyond a confined radius around the hearth. A blaze blazed. Vapor twisted upward, but advanced just 10 feet away, and you were already in an ice container again. Written accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries characterize aristocratic families positioning directly in front of the flames, wraps drawn over their heads, while behind them attendants stamped their lower limbs to maintain circulation. The blaze generated a sphere of bearable heat, but the stone around it refused to surrender. Now, an interesting observation from travelers' journals. Some complained that the barriers themselves perspired. Moisture condensed on the frigid stone and descended in streaks, creating chambers moist and disagreeable. Envision resting in sleeping surface and detecting tiny trickles striking the ground beside you all evening extended. Not precisely the lullaby you desired. In certain seasons, moss even developed on the interior areas. So yes, you resided inside a fortress, but at times it resembled more of a cavern. Contemporary scholars continue wrestling with the question of whether wall hangings and draperies truly created much difference. We envision magnificent barriers lined with richly woven material, but did those substantial materials genuinely insulate the space, or did they merely embellish? Some researchers contend they reduced currents noticeably, generating pockets of heat behind the drapery. Others think this was inflated in subsequent romanticized characterizations, indicating that even the richest material couldn't compete with freezing atmosphere filtering through unglazed openings and entrance gaps. The debate persists unresolved, but it informs you one thing clearly. Individuals were desperate enough to attempt nearly anything. So, envision it presently. You enter a sleeping chamber in late January. The blaze in the hearth is minimal, perhaps already flickering. The barriers ascend like cliffs around you, their surface slick with condensation. Even wrapped in strata of wool, you shiver. The sleeping surface stands proud in the center, substantial draperies drawn around it. Behind those draperies, the atmosphere might be a few degrees heated, a little shelter carved out of the cold. But outside them, the chamber seems like a stone crypt. The psychological impact was just as severe. Individuals documented dreading the cold more than hunger or even affliction. At minimum, hunger and affliction passed ultimately. The cold was relentless. Every solitary evening of the winter season, when you resided in a fortress, you couldn't avoid it. That perception of imprisonment in your own residence left its mark. You envision resting there, drawing the coverlet secure, listening to the hiss of wind sneaking through narrow openings. Your ears burn with cold. Your fingers stiffen. Even your visions, when they arrive, are haunted by images of ice and blaze. The stone barriers surround you not like a protective barrier, but like a refrigerator that never switches off. And here's where your viewpoint shifts. Fortresses weren't magnificent in daily existence. They were continuation machines, yes, but they created you pay a cost for that safeguarding. Ease was sacrificed for protection, and every winter's evening reminded you that stone might maintain you safe from projectiles, but it would never maintain you heated. The more you consider it, the clearer it turns. Resting in a medieval fortress was less about resting peacefully and more about staging a small conflict against the environment. The adversary was invisible but pitiless, and the battlefield was perpetually the same. Your chamber, your sleeping surface, your body. And if you lay still long enough in that chamber, the fortress would begin to speak to you. Not in any mystical sense, but in the language of stone and wind and human vigilance. From somewhere high above, a watch bell tolled. One stroke for the first hour. Past Compline, the final prayer of the day. Then silence settled back like a blanket, heavier than before for having been briefly broken. This was the rhythm of the medieval night, not the continuous dark of our modern conception, but a marked and measured darkness, punctuated by bells at each canonical hour, each toll a reminder that time was being kept, that the world outside continued even as sleep claimed the chambers within. You would hear the sentries too, if you lay still enough. Their footsteps traveled the walkway above the walls in slow, deliberate circuits, leather soles scraping stone in a rhythm that had likely never changed in the lifetime of the fortress. Occasionally, a cough carried down, or the muffled exchange of two men trading the watch, their words inaudible, but their presence a kind of reassurance. The canines in the courtyard stirred sometimes, a bark erupting without warning and dying just as quickly. Horses shifted in the stable below the hall. A door latched somewhere in the far passage. These sounds were not disturbances. They were the texture of a living place, reminders that the fortress breathed through the night even when most of its inhabitants had surrendered to darkness. Then there were the sounds of the building itself. Timber beams contracted in the cold, with a crack so sharp it could startle you from near sleep. The mortar between stones was porous, and on severe nights the wind found paths through it, producing a thin, sustained note like a ghost singing from within the walls. Draperies stirred with no apparent cause. The candle flame bent sideways, recovered, bent again. Medieval individuals were not frightened by these sounds. They had grown up inside them. The fortress at night was known territory, its acoustics as familiar as the faces of the household. What unsettled was not the sounds themselves, but the cold that accompanied them. The understanding that all this vigilance, all these sentries and bolted doors and thick stone, still could not prevent the freeze from settling into your bones as you lay there waiting for dawn. You move across the chamber ground, and instead of floor coverings, or polished timber, your boots crunch against something far humbler, rushes strewn across the stone. These weren't merely embellishment. They were a practical attempt to cushion the cold underfoot, absorb spills, and most importantly, function as a crude form of insulation. Documents from the latter Middle Ages characterize how households renewed the rushes a few times each year, stratifying them substantial in aristocratic chambers and quarters. When freshly positioned, they carried faintly of the outdoors, grassy, earthy, nearly pleasant. For a brief period, you might sense as though a portion of summer had been transported inside. The plants added cushioning, dampened footfalls, and assisted hold in what minimal heat could be captured near the ground. But the appeal didn't persist. Over time, the rushes developed foul, nourishment remnants, spilled brew, and stray bones from the celebration lodged themselves within. Rodents and insects addressed the ground as their domain. If you're envisioning a comfortable natural floor covering, reconsider. By the conclusion of winter, the rushes could be so filthy that one French moralist complained it was like resting in a refuse heap. What strikes you as intriguing is how these rushes functioned double duty. Yes, they captured a thin stratum of heat, but they also absorbed moisture from the moist stone. In a fortress where condensation trickled perpetually from the barriers, this mattered. Otherwise, every advance would have been across slick stone and puddles of freezing liquid. A peculiar aside appears in certain English household accounts. Herbs such as lavender, rosemary, or meadowsweet were sometimes sprinkled among the rushes. The concept was partly practical. Strong-smelling plants disguised odor from rotting remnants, but it also provided a whiff of ease in spaces otherwise substantial with vapor and moist. Envision settling into sleeping surface and catching a faint note of lavender beneath the overwhelming aroma of wet wool and timber vapor. It wouldn't create you heated, but it might create the evening a little more tolerable. There's an ongoing debate among architectural historians about just how effective these rushes truly were. Some contend they genuinely provided heat by generating an insulating mat between human lower limbs and frozen stone. Others dismiss them as largely symbolic gestures of order and cleanliness, indicating that most of the heat loss originated from barriers and ceilings. Anyway, the evidence is incomplete, and so the question persists, were the rushes a true medieval technology of heat, or merely a messy habit disguised as tradition? You envision yourself presently resting in sleeping surface, while an attendant finishes scattering new rushes across the chamber. They crunch quietly underfoot, releasing faint aromas as they're trampled down. For a transient instant, the space seems cleaner, nearly civilized, but you understand that by morning, the rushes will already have absorbed the moistness and the cycle of decay will commence again. Consider the sensory overload of such a sleeping room. Beneath your sheets, you might sense the ease of wool or animal skin, but ascending around you is the musty aroma of old rushes, the sharp tang of herbs, and the omnipresent vapor adhering to your garments. The ground rustles as rodents scurry in pursuit of fragments. Every detail reminds you that continuation, not privilege, characterized your rest. Yet, there's a kind of cleverness in it too. These individuals used the most straightforward materials, plants assembled from riverbanks and fields, and transformed them into tools for enduring the extended winter. They didn't think in terms of floor coverings or insulation. They thought in terms of whatever could maintain the freeze a fraction further away. So as you rest your head in this envisioned chamber, you comprehend that even the ground beneath you was part of the nightly battle against the cold. Stone was the adversary, rushes a fragile barrier. And every morning commenced with the question, how, extended until these two betrayed you with moistness and decay. But before you ever descended into your sleeping surface, there was one final act of preparation that made the difference between an endurable evening and a wretched one: the warming of the sleeping surface itself. In households with even modest means, an attendant would be sent ahead as the meal ended. Their task was simple but essential. They carried heated stones, wrapped in layers of rough linen, from beside the kitchen fire to the sleeping chamber. These they pressed deep beneath the coverings, positioning them at the foot of the sleeping surface where cold was most biting, working the warmth upward through the strata of wool and animal skin. Wealthier households possessed warming pans, long-handled copper or iron vessels shaped like shallow dishes with perforated lids, filled with glowing coals from the hearth, and swept slowly through the interior of the sleeping surface. The attendant moved them in broad arcs beneath the coverings, trapping heat inside the enclosed space. When they finally withdrew, drawing the draperies shut behind them, the air within the canopy was measurably warmer than the chamber beyond. This was not luxury. This was medicine. Surgeons and physicians of the era agreed that a cold sleeping surface shocked the body's vital spirits, disrupting the humors and leaving the sleeper vulnerable to affliction. To enter a pre-warmed bed was to enter correctly, allowing the body to relax gradually rather than seizing against the sudden cold. There is something genuinely moving about the practice. Someone, an attendant, a spouse, a mother, took deliberate care in preparing the place where you would rest. The warming of the bed was an act of tenderness translated into physical preparation. No words were required. The gesture said everything about what it meant to be looked after. Envision it presently. You have lingered by the dying hall fire as long as you can. Now you mount the spiral stair, wrap pulled tight, breath already misting. You lift the latch of your chamber door. The room beyond is cold. Yes, the stone walls radiate their perpetual chill. But you cross to the sleeping surface and pull back the drapery. A breath of warmer air rises to meet you, faint as a whispered reassurance. The linen inside is not heated, merely less cold than everything around it. But those few degrees feel like the difference between despair and hope. You slide inside quickly, drawing the drapery shut. The warmth of the stones presses against your feet. You curl inward, drawing your knees up, conserving what has been given. The cold retreats a little, not enough to be comfortable, but enough, just enough. You position on the border of the sleeping surface presently, running your fingers across the strata of material accumulated high. If there was one medieval continuation secret against the evening freeze, it was material. Wool, linen, and animal skin became the weapons of selection, wrapped and stratified until you resembled a shelter rather than a sleeper. Documents from household inventories created clear just how central textiles were to medieval existence. Linen sheets were regarded the baseline, smooth and cool against the flesh, though far less insulating than what arrived on top. Over that arrived substantial woolen coverings, heavy enough that certain individuals compared them to the weight of a canine. And if you possessed the prosperity, you added animal skin coverlets, fox, sable, or even bear. Aristocrats invested fortunes into such bedding, not solely for display, but because without it, winter evenings could be lethal. But there's an amusing observation buried in the sources. Attendants sometimes joked that their masters couldn't shift once they were secured in. So numerous strata pinned them down that rotating over required a monumental effort. Envision being swaddled in 5 or 6 heavy coverings, so tightly secured that you either remained still or risked drawing the covers off and freezing. Heat arrived at the cost of mobility, a trade-off most were prepared to create. Animal skin deserves special attention. Beyond privilege, it was genuinely practical. Arctic fox pelts, marten skins, and sheepskin all provided dense heat. One chronicler characterizes an aristocratic female in Burgundy who refused to travel without her ermine-lined sleeping coverings, even in summer, because she feared catching freezes at evening. To us, it sounds absurd, but in an age where currents slice through every space, paranoia about cold was entirely rational. A strange custom appears in certain households. Some individuals believed resting beneath too much linen was unhealthy because linen was thought to extract the body's heat. To balance this, they deliberately stratified wool or animal skin above and below, generating what we might call a textile sandwich. The concept was that linen cooled, wool heated, and animal skin captured it all in. Whether the theory functioned scientifically is doubtful, but it demonstrates how individuals mixed folklore with practical ease. Scholars proceed to puzzle over the social significance of these textiles. Was animal skin truly about continuation, or was it mostly status signaling? On one hand, inventories prove that prosperous aristocrats collected enormous numbers of animal skin coverlets. On the other hand, impoverished families survived without them, relying on coarse wool instead. Some historians contend that animal skins were primarily symbols of authority and rank, while others maintain they were a crucial necessity in current-filled fortresses. The reality likely positions somewhere in between. They were both life-saving tools and markers of prestige. Now envision yourself beneath these strata. The wool itches faintly against your flesh, rougher than contemporary textiles. Above that, the animal skin seems dense and nearly suffocating. But, at minimum, it maintains the cold at distance. The coverings press you into the straw sleeping surface with their sheer weight. You shift, but solely slightly. Any bigger movement would invite frozen atmosphere into the shelter. Your exhalation heats the area around your face, while the remainder of you relies completely on the barrier of material. The quietness of the space magnifies every feeling. The rustle of linen, the coarse scratch of wool, the faint, musky odor of animal pelts. There's something intimate and primal about it. You are wrapped in the skins and fibers of the natural environment. Every thread and hair a reminder that continuation depends on transforming the environment itself into armor. And in that consideration lies the essence of medieval rest. To rest was to construct a stronghold inside a stronghold, not with fortifications and moats, but with sheets and animal skins. Each evening, you barricaded yourself against the cold with whatever textiles you could muster. Without them, even the most magnificent fortress chamber would seem like the inside of a crypt. So, as you rest there in this envisioned shelter, you commence to comprehend the nightly ceremony. Assemble strata, weigh yourself down, and hope they maintain until morning. The cold might rattle the coverings, advance through the stones, and swirl around your sleeping surface. But inside the stronghold of material, you stood a battling opportunity. The sleeping surface itself was more than a piece of furniture. It was a machine constructed to generate a small, livable climate inside an otherwise hostile space. When you draw back the substantial draperies of a medieval four-poster, you aren't merely glimpsing into someone's private resting area. You're advancing into a micro-environment constructed for continuation. Detailed inventories from aristocratic households demonstrate how important these magnificent sleeping surfaces were. unlike the simple pallets of commoners. These frames ascended off the ground, tall as a person, carved from oak or walnut. The posts stood like pillars, frequently ornately embellished, and extended upward to support a canopy. That canopy wasn't solely embellishment. It was practical. By draping draperies down the flanks, you captured your own body heat inside. It transformed a frozen chamber into something faintly resembling heat. Consider it like a medieval tent inside your sleeping room. Once the draperies were sealed, the difference could be dramatic. The heat from your exhalation, from your body, from the substantial bedding, all collected within a current-filled space where the temperature might hover just above freezing. Those additional few degrees could indicate the difference between a wretched evening and something bearable. There's an often referenced document from a French duchess who traveled with her sleeping surface dismantled and packed on wagons. Why proceed to that difficulty? Because the sleeping surface wasn't merely furniture, it was life support. To rest in an unfamiliar fortress or abbey without your own canopy and draperies was to risk shivering all evening extended. An interesting detail emerges in certain English sources. The draperies themselves were sometimes treated with wax or lined with oiled material to block currents more effectively. Envision drawing those draperies, sealed the material heavy, faintly carrying the aroma of beeswax or resin. They didn't merely block the cold, they also generated obscurity, dampening sound and illumination, providing the impression of privacy in spaces that were seldom truly private. Contemporary scholars continue discussing how effective these sleeping surfaces truly were. Did they genuinely heat sleepers, or do subsequent romantic characterizations inflate their usefulness? Archaeological evidence proposes the draperies were substantial and stratified, so there's reason to believe they functioned. Yet, some contend the heat was psychological as much as physical. The sensation of being enclosed, protected, concealed away from the cavernous cold. The debate proceeds, but what remains certain is that individuals believed in their importance so intensely that portable sleeping surfaces became an aristocratic necessity. Presently, envision yourself sliding into one. The sleeping surface groans beneath your weight. The straw sleeping surface rustles, and then you extend to draw the drapery sealed. Instantly, the atmosphere seems different. Still cold, yes, but no longer assaulted by currents from the narrow openings. Your exhalation fogs less rapidly. Your body relaxes into the stratified coverings, and you perceive that you might actually drift into rest. The drapery dampens the faint trickle of liquid from the barriers, the far cough of an attendant in the corridor, even the bark of a canine outside. Inside, it carries the aroma of material and animal skin, faintly musky but reassuring. You detect solely the rustle of your coverings when you shift. The chamber beyond may be enormous and inhospitable, but here, in your sleeping surface, you've carved out a pocket of existence against the elements. It wasn't flawless. Certain evenings, the draperies froze rigid where condensation collected. Other evenings, the vapor from the hearth drifted inside, choking you awake. But for most aristocrats, the four-poster canopy sleeping surface represented the optimal defense available against the nightly siege of cold. And this is where you comprehend the cleverness of medieval individuals. Wasn't in magnificent inventions, but in small, intelligent adaptations. No modern heating? Then construct a private climate sphere. No insulation? Then suspend substantial draperies and seal yourself in. Every evening was a negotiation with the cold, and the canopy sleeping surface was the nearest thing to a truce. Envision resting there presently, your eyelids heavy, the environment beyond the drapery fading into quietness. The chamber is still frigid, the fortress still current-filled, but you've created an area where continuation seems achievable. You drift towards rest, not because the evening has developed heated, but because you've managed, through material and timber, to outwit it just enough. And as you drift, consider what medieval individuals believed happened next. Sleep was not merely a suspension of consciousness, it was a threshold. Church teachings held that the sleeping hours were when the soul became most active, when it might receive divine messages or encounter spiritual forces that could not reach it during the noise and distraction of the waking day. Dreams were taken seriously. Not every dream. Of course, the physician Galen, whose writings shaped medieval medical thinking for centuries, distinguished between mere phantasms produced by indigestion or troubled humors and true visitations that arrived in the deepest watches of the night. A dream preceded by the correct preparations, prayer, moderate supper, clean conscience, carried weight. One that arrived on a full stomach after an excess of wine was treated with suspicion. Kings consulted their confessors about significant dreams. Abbesses recorded the visions of particularly holy sisters. Even ordinary individuals kept track of recurring images, believing they might carry warnings about health, weather, or the state of distant relations. The sleeping self was understood to be permeable in ways the waking self was not, open to guidance, open to danger. This lent the act of going to sleep a peculiar weight. You were not merely resting your body, you were releasing your soul into an unguarded territory. Hence the bedside prayers, the final petitions before crossing that threshold, asking for protection against the forces that walked the medieval night. An interesting note appears in several household documents. The practice of keeping a small illuminated manuscript or devotional image near the sleeping surface so that one could pray upon waking and greet whatever vision the night had brought with grace rather than confusion. Envision your eyes closing now. Beyond the draperies, the chamber is dark, the candle long since burned down to its stub. The world narrows to the weight of coverings, the faint residual warmth at your feet, the slow deepening of your own breath. Whatever the night brings, cold, or dreams, or the distant toll of the watch bell, you are as protected as the age permits. Enclosed in wool and timber, you release yourself to the dark hours as those who slept in this place before you learned to do across countless winters. Beneath all those coverings and draperies, the foundation of your evening's rest was still the sleeping surface itself. What rested under you could determine whether you passed the evening in some level of ease or whether you woke aching, frozen, and irritable. In the Middle Ages, bedding arrived in numerous forms, but two stood out: the feather sleeping surface and the straw tick. The feather sleeping surface was the privilege selection. Envision descending into a sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, gentle and flexible, cradling your body with heat. Inventories from aristocratic estates frequently list multiple feather sleeping surfaces, carefully stored and transported with the household whenever the ruler traveled. A well-stuffed feather sleeping surface could be so substantial that one positioned nearly a foot above the sleeping surface frame a bouncy cushion in an otherwise merciless chamber. Families prized them, guarded them, and transferred them down as treasured possessions. They weren't merely pleasant, they were symbols of status. But here's a variation. Feather sleeping surfaces could also become suffocatingly warm, capturing body heat until sleepers woke drenched in perspiration, even in winter. One amusing complaint survives from a 15th century letter where a visitor moaned that his host's sleeping surface swallowed him like a goose in a pot. Too numerous feathers indicated you descended too deep and instead of gently cushioned rest, you spent the evening struggling to crawl back to the surface. For most individuals, though, the reality was a straw tick, a large sack filled with straw, hay, or reeds, stuffed until it formed a crude sleeping surface. Commoners used them, soldiers used them, and even fortresses filled their lesser chambers with them. They were inexpensive, easy to refill, and moderately effective at lifting you off the frozen ground. But straw arrived with its own curses. It flattened rapidly, poked through the material, and frequently harbored fleas. Households had to beat the sleeping surface regularly, literally whacking and shaking the straw sack to fluff it up and drive out vermin. By morning, your body might itch from straw scratches, but at minimum you'd survive the evening. Contemporary sources observe a strange detail. Certain individuals mixed herbs into the straw, not solely to sweeten the aroma, but also to ward off pests. Lavender, mint, or pennyroyal might be tossed in, leaving a faint fragrance that masked the sour odor of moist hay. If you've ever rested on a straw-stuffed sleeping surface, you understand the aroma never entirely departs. It persists, earthy and musty, seeping into garments and hair. Researchers continue debating just how common feather sleeping surfaces truly were. Some contend they were rare privileges reserved for the very top tier of society. Others indicate to documents demonstrating middling households possessing at minimum one feather sleeping surface, proposing they were more widespread than assumed. The disagreement originates from incomplete evidence, but what it reveals is that resting surfaces matter deeply enough to be meticulously documented. Envision yourself resting down on a straw tick in a current-filled chamber. The sack rustles beneath you, uneven lumps pressing against your reverse. Each shift releases a puff of grassy aroma mixed with the faint sharpness of herbs. You detect the tiny scurry of rodents somewhere within the rushes on the ground, and you question if they'll pay you a visit. The coverings above press heavy, but the straw below reminds you that ease in this age was never guaranteed. Presently, envision the alternative: a feather sleeping surface in an aristocratic space. You descend deep into the gentleness, your body embraced by down. It seems heavenly until the heat develops stifling. The feathers shift, and you roll into a hollow that cradles you a little too tightly. You push at the coverings, pursuing fresh atmosphere, but the draperies capture everything in. You descend back into rest anyway. Understanding this discomfort is still 1,000 times superior than straw. The selection between straw and feathers mirrored the medieval social ladder. To rest on feathers was to belong to the privileged. To rest on straw was to accept necessity. Both, however, were responses to the identical challenge: maintaining the body alive in cold, merciless stone chambers. And so, as you drift off in your envisioned sleeping surface this evening, you comprehend that medieval sleepers were never passive. Every sleeping surface, whether humble or magnificent, represented effort, adaptation, and a small triumph over the cold. You didn't merely collapse into sleeping surface. You created a tactical decision: descend into feathers or endure straw, all in the aspiration of surviving until dawn. Even the most carefully constructed sleeping surface, with its draperies, feather sleeping surfaces, and heaps of coverings, couldn't always guarantee continuation on its own. What created the difference on the most frigid evenings wasn't furniture. It was association. Resting alone in a stone chamber indicated your body heat merely bled into the barriers. Resting beside others indicated heat multiplied. Bodies functioning like radiators pressed together in the obscurity. Aristocratic families comprehended this, though they seldom admitted it openly. Attendants frequently rested in adjoining spaces, or even on pallets at the base of the master's sleeping surface. The arrangement wasn't solely about service or protection, it was also practical. More individuals in an area indicated higher temperatures, even if solely by a few precious degrees. You might not observe the heat initially, but arrive midnight, when ice assembled on the inside of the coverings, every additional body counted. Accounts from medieval monasteries reveal that monks rested in extended rows, their cots or straw sleeping surfaces side by side in current-filled dormitories. The reasoning wasn't solely communal discipline, it was also continuation. In those crowded quarters, body heat generated a stratum of insulation, however thin. The identical principle applied in barracks, where soldiers pressed in rows, wraps drawn secure, trusting that together they'd resist the freeze superior than alone. An interesting anecdote originates from a 14th century English manor. One nobleman's will specifically ordered that his favorite squire be granted a location near his ruler's chamber, blaze at evening. Scholars interpret this not solely as a mark of favor, but as an admission that the heat of companionship was as valuable as inheritance. To be invited to distribute a sleeping surface or chamber was not merely intimacy, it was a privilege of heat. There was, of course, another stratum to the practice. Animals, canines in particular, became literal heaters. The phrase, "a 3-canine evening," may originate from much subsequent folklore, but the concept is rooted in reality. Medieval individuals frequently permitted hounds into the sleeping surface, not solely for companionship, but because the animals radiated heat. A couple of large mastiffs curled at your lower limbs might indicate the difference between numb toes and ease. Travelers even documented that in certain inns, visitors rested packed together with canines, goats, or even sheep beside them. The aroma was intense, but heat trumped fragrance. Superior fleas than frostbite. Superior a filthy covering than an evening without rest. The sensory mix is unforgettable. The earthy aroma of canine animal skin, the faint vapor adhering to your garments, the heavy press of coverings, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of another creature's respiration. It's no wonder individuals spoke of their animals with affection bordering on reverence. To distribute heat was to distribute continuation. The image of the 3-canine evening, though a phrase coined much subsequently, captures the essence of medieval resting habits. 1 canine indicated manageable cold. 2 indicated serious freeze. 3 indicated the evening was so severe that even aristocrats stacked every achievable source of heat into the sleeping surface. So, as you rest there in your own sleeping surface this evening, consider how extraordinary it must have seemed for individuals in fortresses isolated by stone, assaulted by currents, surrounded by obscurity, to draw strength and ease from the simple loyalty of an animal curled by their flank. In that small exchange of heat, human and canine maintained each other alive through innumerable winter evenings. But there was a peculiarity of medieval sleep that modern people rarely consider. The night itself was divided not by alarm clocks or light pollution, but by the body's own rhythms. In an age before artificial illumination changed what the dark hours meant, many historians now believe that medieval individuals did not sleep in a single continuous stretch. Instead, they experienced what some researchers call segmented sleep, a first sleep lasting perhaps 3 or 4 hours, followed by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep until dawn. The evidence is scattered throughout the documents. Writers describe waking naturally after midnight, lying in the darkness, listening to the household breathe, sometimes rising briefly to pray, sometimes simply thinking, processing the day, contemplating a decision, speaking quietly with a bed partner about matters too private for the daylight world to contain. One particularly revealing account from a Flemish merchant's diary notes that he regularly woke at what he estimates was the second hour past midnight to record his thoughts before the second sleep claimed him. He describes this middle waking not as a disturbance, but as a cherished interval, a space of profound quiet that belonged to him alone, bracketed by darkness on either side. Medical writers of the era actually prescribed activities for this wakeful interval. Moderate prayer was recommended. So was light reading if illumination permitted, or brief conversation with a sleeping partner on matters of comfort. Certain physicians even suggested that this was the ideal hour for conceiving children, because the body was rested from the first sleep and the reproductive humors were thought to be most favorable. The monastery organized its entire night around similar logic. Matins tolled at the deepest hour, 2 or 3 in the morning, calling the brothers from their first sleep to the chapel for prayers. They rose, crossed the cold cloister in darkness, chanted their offices, and returned to their dormitory for the second sleep before dawn. Far from being an imposition, this midnight punctuation was understood as a gift, an hour standing at the center of the night, awake while the world slept, close to something ordinarily inaccessible. Envision yourself in that in-between hour now. The canine at your feet shifts in size. The fortress around you breathes its stone quietness. You are not distressed, not cold enough to suffer, simply present in the suspended middle of the night, resting between sleeps, your mind moving slowly through images without insistence. The watch bell tolls its note, unwinding through the darkness and fading into stillness. You feel yourself beginning to descend again toward the second sleep, deeper, sometimes, than the first. The body knows its own wisdom. Surrender to it. Draw the draperies back momentarily and advance outside the aristocratic chamber. In your imagination, across the courtyard, in the shadowed attendants' quarters, another environment of rest unfolds. The contrast between commoner and aristocratic slumber was stark, and yet the outcome, continuation through severe evenings, was the identical goal. Who then truly rested heated? The response might surprise you. Aristocrats had magnificence, feather sleeping surfaces, animal skin coverlets, warming devices, and substantial canopies. But magnificence did not perpetually indicate ease. Their sleeping chambers were cavernous, constructed for display as much as for rest, and all that area created them impossible to heat. Even with roaring blazes, the stone swallowed heat like a sponge. So a ruler might rest on heaps of down and animal skin, yet still exhale atmosphere that froze into mist before his vision. Meanwhile, commoners resided in humbler dwellings of timber and clay, small enough that a solitary hearth heated the complete interior. A thatched roof substantial with straw functioned as insulation. Families pressed together, frequently with animals stabled at one conclusion of the space, and the combined heat maintained the atmosphere far more bearable than in a current-filled tower. A visitor to a 14th century English village documented with mild astonishment that though the shelters were mean, they maintained heat far superior than the ruler's tower. And yet, status determined more than ease. Aristocrats possessed access to finer materials, wool of high quality, imported animal skins, linen that softened with laundering. Commoners created dew with coarse wool and coverings patched until they thinned, or sheepskins cured roughly in smokehouses, their bedding carried intensely of lanolin and hearth vapor, and though it insulated well, it never appeared or seemed privileged. One interesting observation from memorial documents demonstrates that commoners sometimes rested directly on benches near the blaze. Their offspring curled in their laps. They risked sparks and vapor, but the closeness to the hearth guaranteed heat. In contrast, the aristocrat's sleeping chamber, separated from the central chamber, frequently lacked that immediate heat. Ease was thus unevenly distributed, not perpetually in the manner you'd expect. Researchers today continue puzzling over the genuine hierarchy of heat. Did prosperity automatically purchase you superior rest? Or did commoners, in their cramped but snug cottages, manage to endure the winter evenings more easily? Evidence indicates both directions. Some scholars contend that aristocrats' sheer volume of textiles maintained them superior. Others maintain the smaller communal areas of the lower classes offered practical heat that the aristocracy's magnificence could not match. The discussion remains unresolved, highlighting how much rest itself mirrored social divisions. Envision presently the two scenes side by side. In the fortress, a nobleman shifts beneath heavy strata, his exhalation twisting white, the enormous space echoing with every gust of wind against the coverings. Down in the village, a commoner family squeezes onto a straw sleeping surface before the hearth. Offspring nestled like kittens, the aroma of animals drifting from the stall nearby. One sleeping surface is ornate and rigidly formal, the other crowded and earthy. But which body wakes heated? The question persists, and perhaps no single response fits all cases. Still, both aristocrat and commoner distributed one truth: they adapted. Continuation in the medieval evening was not about absolute ease, but about learning to exist with hardship, reshaping residences and habits until rest became achievable. Aristocrats may have flaunted privilege. Commoners may have relied on closeness and simplicity, but all rested beneath the identical winter stars, shivering and dreaming their method toward morning. As you drift in your own heated sleeping service this evening, you can perceive the contradiction. Status determined the trappings, but not perpetually the quality of medieval rest. Sometimes the humblest shelter maintained more genuine heat than the grandest chamber. You might assume that once a sleeping surface was established in an aristocratic chamber, it never shifted. After all, these sleeping surfaces were massive objects heavy with carved posts and draperies. But in practice, families frequently shifted where they rested, according to the season. Sleeping rooms were not fixed, timeless sanctuaries. They were flexible areas selected for their relationship to sunlight, blaze, and wind. In other terms, you pursued the sun in winter and fled it in summer. Documents from aristocratic estates reveal this habit plainly. Certain fortresses possessed winter chambers and summer chambers, not because individuals desired a change of scenery, but because the physics of heat demanded it. In frigid months, families shifted into spaces with southern exposure, where the weak sun struck through the openings for a few precious hours each day. The barriers there stored a little more heat. The atmosphere seemed a little less hostile, and waking up wasn't quite so brutal. Arrived summer, they abandoned those sunlit areas and retreated into north-facing spaces, darker and cooler. There is a well-documented example in the accounts of Edward IV's household, where complete sleeping surfaces and furnishings were shifted seasonally. Attendants transported feather sleeping surfaces, linens, and wall hangings from one chamber to another, generating temporary nests wherever the monarch selected to rest. It was a logistical ordeal, but for those residing in stone palaces, mobility was essential to survive. An interesting observation survives from a Burgundian courtier who complained in a letter that he lost his chamber to the ice 1 year. The barriers, he stated, developed so moist and frigid that he refused to rest there, selecting instead a narrower space facing the ascending sun. His phrasing reminds us that in fortresses, the construction itself was an adversary. Spaces were conquered by cold, surrendered, and retaken with the seasons. Archaeologists and architectural historians continue debating whether every fortress truly offered multiple seasonal chambers, or whether this was a privilege of the grandest estates. Some contend that the majority of fortresses possessed solely a few suitable spaces for resting, compelling residents to endure the cold where they were. Others maintain that evidence of opening placements, blazes, and surviving documents demonstrates intentional design for seasonal residing. The contention remains unresolved, but the image is persuasive. An aristocratic family migrating within its own barriers, like birds shifting nests as the climate transformed. Presently, envision yourself pursuing this routine. In autumn, you commence to eye the sunlit flank of the tower, understanding that soon the extended evenings will demand every advantage. Attendants dismantle your sleeping surface, transporting frame, sleeping surface, and hangings piece by piece. The sound of carpenters adjusting posts echoes in the new chamber, while wall hangings are hammered into position to block currents. By the time the initial ice arrives, you are secured into a space that at minimum greets you with pale shafts of morning illumination. The sensory detail is vivid. You wake to the thin heat of the sun filtering through coverings, the aroma of woolen draperies freshly rehung, and the faint sound of attendants sweeping rushes across the ground of your relocated chamber. The shift does not eliminate the cold. It merely manages it, transforming unbearable into survivable. Commoners, too, shifted their resting areas seasonally, though less formally. Families might rest close to the hearth in winter, crowding around the blaze in one space, and then retreat to lofts or storage structures in summer, where the atmosphere was cooler. In both fortresses and cottages, rest was mobile, dictated by the elements rather than interior design. This practice reminds you that medieval existence possessed little of our contemporary notion of fixed sleeping rooms. A sleeping room wasn't a permanent, sacred area. It was a temporary encampment within the larger stronghold of stone. Sleeping surfaces were shifted, chambers rotated, and existence adapted in rhythm with the seasons. The fortress was alive, reshaped by illumination and temperature, its inhabitants shifting like nomads within its barriers. And so, you perceive another truth of medieval rest. It was dynamic, not static. The battle against cold demanded movement, planning, and constant adjustment. You did not rest where you desired. You rested where the sun, the wind, and the moist permitted. And each year as the earth transformed, you commenced that cycle again, positioned for a moment by the confined opening of a medieval chamber, and sense the current slip across your flesh. Unlike today's residences, with their glass panes and sealed frames, fortress openings were vulnerable holes in the barrier. They were defenses against projectiles, but invitations to the wind, without glass, without double glazing, without even the notion of insulation. These openings were merely coverings or extended material that maintained out little more than rain and birds. Written surveys of medieval households reveal that in numerous fortresses, glass was so uncommon it was reserved for chapels or the ruler's private oratory. Ordinary chambers possessed timber coverings, substantial planks that could be secured from the inside. In summer, they stood open for illumination and atmosphere. but in winter they sealed secure, groaning in the wind. Yet timber alone was no barrier against the freeze. Cold advanced through gaps, and the space developed moist. A practical solution was to extend material across the opening, sometimes linen soaked in oil or wax, to create it translucent and resistant to rain. By day, this permitted a dim amber radiance to enter, gentle and hazy like sunlight through parchment. By evening, it dulled the shriek of the wind, but never silenced it. The material flapped, the frame rattled, and sleepers learned to exist with the constant reminder that their stronghold was porous. One intriguing reference originates from a 13th century French household account characterizing horn openings. Thin slices of animal horn were scraped translucent and positioned into timber frames. These provided a crude but sturdier alternative to material. They admitted pale illumination and resisted climate superior, though they yellowed rapidly and warped. Envision looking out through such panes, the environment blurred as if witnessed through fogged glass. Yet inside your chamber, the atmosphere just a fraction less brutal. Archaeologists and architectural historians debate how common these horn or oiled material openings truly were. Some contend they were privileges of the wealthiest fortresses, while most households relied solely on coverings. Others propose that by the latter Middle Ages, they were surprisingly widespread in Northern Europe. The evidence is fragmentary, but the very existence of debate reminds us how desperate individuals were to improvise barriers between themselves and the cold. Presently, envision yourself at such an opening. The covering is drawn, the material tacked across the frame, and still a sharp line of ice develops along the sill. Your exhalation clouds as you lean near it. Beyond, the snow reflects the moon. But inside, you detect the faint rattle of timber and the moan of wind pursuing a gap. Regardless of how carefully you suspend your sleeping surface draperies, you understand the current will discover its method to you. The soundscape is haunting. Coverings banging in a far corridor, material snapping faintly like sails, attendants muttering as they stuff rags into gaps. Certain households even pressed moss or clay into gaps around the frames as makeshift insulation. It was messy, unsightly, and temporary. But when the evening dipped below freezing, any measure was superior than none. Commoners in cottages confronted the identical battle. Their dwellings frequently possessed no openings at all, just coverings to seal off confined slits. Some used bladder membranes from animals, extended thin to allow in illumination. The effect was eerie. Spaces radiated faintly, but with distorted shadows, as if the environment outside were behind a veil. At evening, though, even these coverings hardened with ice, transforming translucent sheets into brittle ice. For aristocrats, the contradiction was severe. Their high towers provided them status and defense, but also exposed them to cutting winds. Visitors sometimes remarked that the higher they rested, the more frigid they seemed. A commoner in his low shelter might envy the prosperity of a ruler, but not the current whistling through a tower chamber opening. And yet, there was beauty too. Envision resting in sleeping surface on a moonlit evening. The coverings cracked just enough to allow silver illumination wash across the ground. The cold seeped in, yes, but there's poetry in shadows. The silhouette of branches against the drapery, the faint radiance of snow outside. Medieval rest was a balance of discomfort and wonder, where the harshest evenings also offered moments of fragile peace. So when you draw your own draperies this evening, envision those ancient openings. They were less barriers than reminders that regardless of how substantial the barriers, the evening perpetually discovered its method in. Rest was never about conquering the cold completely. It was about learning to exist with it, current after current, until morning broke. Consider for a moment what it meant to arrive at a fortress as a traveler in winter, not as a resident who knew every draft and every strategy, but as a stranger trusting to the hospitality of a household entirely unprepared for your comfort. Travelers documented their experiences in letters and diaries with a candor that residents sometimes lacked. They had no loyalty to the fortresses they visited, no need to defend the reputation of stone walls that left them shivering. And so, they recorded the truth plainly. One merchant traveling through Burgundy in the early 15th century wrote to his wife that the sleeping chamber he was given faced north, that the covering on the sleeping surface was thin and smelled of someone else's animals, and that by midnight he had put on every garment he possessed, including his boots, and still could not feel his toes. A diplomat's account from the English court describes rising at dawn to discover his washwater frozen solid, and his inkwell congealed so thoroughly that he could not write until he held it near a candle for some minutes. What strikes you in reading these accounts is not their misery, but their matter-of-factness. These individuals were not melodramatic. They wrote of frozen inkwells and inadequate coverings the same way we might note that a train was late or a restaurant noisy. The cold was a condition of existence, neither surprising nor especially remarkable. You endured it, you recorded it, you moved on. This equanimity is one of the most striking qualities of the medieval sensibility towards sleep and cold. Individuals did not demand warmth as a right. They hoped for it, prepared for it as best they could, and accepted its absence with a practicality that can seem almost incomprehensible from our perspective. Envision carrying that same acceptance into this evening. Not the cold itself, which you are fortunately spared, but the orientation, the understanding that rest is something earned, prepared for, and received with gratitude when it arrives. You envision yourself approaching the hearth of a fortress sleeping chamber, expecting salvation in the blaze. Surely a blaze in a stone space must indicate heat, but the reality is far less reassuring. Medieval blazes were enormous, their chimneys yawning wide enough that complete trees could be nourished into them. Yet, for all their spectacle, they were inadequate at actually heating the area. The reason was simple physics. The wider the chimney, the more heat escaped directly upward with the vapor. Flames roared, sparks danced, timber collapsed into radiating coals, and yet advance more than a few paces away, and your exhalation still misted in the atmosphere. The blaze generated a bright oasis of heat in its immediate circle, but beyond that, the fortress chamber remained severely cold. Household documents emphasize how much timber this demanded. A solitary winter week in a large fortress might consume complete wagon loads of timber. Forest management became a persistent concern, not merely for construction, but for fuel. One ruler in France complained severely in his letters that maintaining his central chamber heated had emptied the woods faster than any conflict. Blazes devoured resources, yet seldom provided the ease one envisioned. There are amusing accounts, too. Visitors sometimes joked that aristocratic blazes were big enough to roast an ox, but too weak to heat a man. The exaggeration rings true. These hearths provided spectacle, illumination, and a perception of majesty, but little genuine relief against the relentless freeze of stone barriers. Certain households experimented with positioning iron firebacks behind the flames, reflecting heat into the space. Others lined hearths with tiles to store heat a little extended. But these measures were partial solutions. tinkering against a problem too large to conquer completely. A blazing blaze might maintain your lower limbs heated if you positioned right in front of it, but your reverse remained frozen, and your sleeping surface across the space might as well have been outdoors. Scholars continue disputing how effective fortress blazes truly were. Some contend they provided meaningful heat when combined with hangings and heavy furniture, generating a stratified system of heat retention. Others maintain they were nearly symbolic, more about status and ceremony than ease, since most of the energy vanished up the chimney. The reality likely varied from fortress to fortress, depending on resources, design, and climate. Presently, envision yourself in such a space. The blaze crackles loudly, spitting sparks onto the hearthstones. Vapor twists upward, leaving a faint tang in the atmosphere. Your face seems flushed, prickling with heat, but your shoulders remain frigid. You move closer, maintaining out your palms until you nearly singe your sleeves. Then, reluctantly, you retreat to your sleeping surface across the chamber, solely to discover the temperature drops with every advance. By the time you slip beneath the coverings, you may as well have been positioning outside. Commoners, by contrast, frequently benefited more from their smaller hearths. A solitary central blaze in a modest cottage heated the whole interior, vaporous though it was. The cramped area indicated that flames and bodies together maintained bearable heat. The magnificent aristocratic blazes, by contrast, burned through resources but left chambers half frozen. Magnificence, once again, failed to translate into ease. And yet the ceremony of the blaze mattered. It wasn't merely about heat. It was about assembling, about illumination, about the reassurance that at minimum, something pushed back against the obscurity. Individuals prayed by the blaze, distributed stories by it, dozed in chairs beside it. Even when the heat didn't transport across the space, the radiance offered psychological safety, a beacon of existence in the cavernous cold. So when you envision a medieval evening, don't consider of a roaring blaze rescuing you from ice. Consider, instead of a fragile island of heat in an ocean of frozen atmosphere, ease that lasted solely as extended as you stayed near, and ease that disappeared the instant you ascended into sleeping surface. The hearth was a performance as much as a practical tool, and the medieval sleeper learned to be appreciative for what little it could provide. You lean closer to that radiating blaze, and for a transient instant it seems safe. But then another reality of medieval existence asserts itself. Vapor. Blazes were not clean, effective machines. They belched fumes, left soot, and filled chambers with a haze that stung the vision and settled on every surface. To remain heated by blaze was to exhale vapor nightly, to accept blackened barriers, and to wake with lungs coated in ash. Writers of the time complained severely about it. One monk in northern England observed that his cell developed so coated with soot from the hearth that he coughed more than he prayed. Even aristocrats weren't immune. Court documents reference women lamenting ruined gowns and linens discolored by persistent vapor exposure. A newly cleaned wall hanging might transform gray within a solitary winter. The architecture created matters worse. Chimneys were wide, crude shafts, without the current control of contemporary flues. Vapor didn't perpetually ascend politely. It drifted, eddied, and adhered to the chamber. If the wind blew the incorrect direction, it poured back into the space, leaving everyone inside coughing. Envision attempting to drift into rest while vapor burned your throat and your vision watered. An interesting observation from travelers' observations is that certain individuals deliberately smeared their barriers with lime or clay, not solely to brighten interiors, but to conceal the streaks of soot. The black residue never truly departed. but at minimum the impression of cleanliness could be restored for a little period. The aroma, however, was permanent, a mixture of charred timber, moist stone, and burned wool that adhered to bedding and garments. Scholars remain divided over just how bearable these vaporous spaces were. Some contend that medieval individuals merely adapted. Their bodies and expectations hardened to it. Others maintain that even contemporaries recognized the health toll, indicating to repeated complaints in medical treatises about choked atmosphere and blackened lungs. Perhaps both are true. Individuals endured because they possessed no selection, but they never halted grumbling about it. Presently, envision yourself resting in sleeping surface after such an evening. Your hair carries the aroma of vapor. Your coverings maintain the acrid tang of ash. And when you cough, you taste bitterness on your tongue. The sleeping surface draperies capture certain of it inside. So even your tiny shelter transports the ghost of the blaze. Your chamber may have been heated than before, but it arrived at the cost of fresh atmosphere. Commoners fared no superior. Their cottages frequently lacked chimneys altogether. Vapor from the central hearth merely ascended and filled the rafters, gradually leaking through the thatch. Offspring developed up in dwellings perpetually hazed with vapor, their lungs blackened before adulthood. Yet individuals perceived it as ordinary. Certain even believed the vapor assisted preserve the timber roof, maintaining insects away. Continuation and superstition blended together in every exhalation. The sensory encounter was overwhelming. Your flesh prickled from soot particles, your vision watered perpetually, and the rushes on the ground assembled black dust. Attendants swept perpetually, though the effort seemed futile. Every winter was the identical, a battle against vapor, a battle against cold, and the knowledge that you couldn't triumph, one without worsening the other. And yet, in spite of the discomfort, blaze was non-negotiable. No one could survive a fortress winter without it. So, individuals created their peace. They suspended vaporous wall hangings proudly. They endured coughing fits. They scrubbed soot from their faces each morning. Heat demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice was clean atmosphere. So as you rest in your contemporary sleeping surface this evening, exhaling comfortably without consideration, regard how extraordinary such privilege is. For medieval sleepers, every heated evening indicated another vaporous morning. Their visions were steeped in the aroma of burning timber. Their existences lived in the shadow of soot. And then came the hour that every sleeper in a medieval fortress dreaded, the hour before dawn. Historians describe it as the coldest point of the night. By this hour, the fires in the lesser chambers had burned down entirely. Even the coals in the great central hearth had dimmed to faint embers. The stone, which had radiated a small measure of residual heat through the early evening, had surrendered its last warmth and was now simply cold, dense, implacable, pulling heat from the air with quiet efficiency. The draperies of your canopy sleeping surface, which had felt almost snug when you drew them shut many hours before, had now absorbed every degree your body could spare. Your toes, tucked in their warmest position since midnight, had begun to ache again. The second sleep, lighter than the first, grew fragile. Those who lived through many fortress winters described this hour in similar terms: a thinning of the night's defenses, a moment when the cold seemed to find previously undiscovered gaps and press through them. Some woke entirely and lay still, waiting for the first gray light at the edge of the drapery. Others drew their knees closer, and pulled the covering over their heads, breathing their own warmth back against themselves. And then, distantly, Capel for lauds. The monks in the chapel below, or in the monastery adjacent, had woken for the final office of the night. Their voices came faintly through stone, a few lines of psalm, the sound carrying the particular quality of voices in cold air, bright and clean as ice itself. Those lines of song were a promise. They marked the turning point, the moment from which the darkness would begin, however slowly, to retreat. Not heat yet, not light yet, but the knowledge that the night had a boundary, and that it was close. Scholars have noted that medieval poetry returns again and again to this hour. The alba, the dawn song, a genre almost entirely built around the bittersweet moment when night ends, when what was sheltered in darkness must face the exposed world of day. The cold was real in these poems, but so was the relief. The night, however harsh, was finite. So when you consider now of that hour before dawn in a medieval fortress, hold both things at once. The bone cold, the thinned draperies, the breath misting against the covering, and alongside it, the distant psalm, the first pale thread of light, the knowledge that continuation had once again been achieved. Every morning in a fortress was a small victory, and every sleeper who reached it had earned it. When the blaze dimmed and the evening extended on, the sole radiance left in a medieval chamber frequently originated from a candle. You might envision this delicate flame as embellishment, a touch of ambience, but for numerous sleepers, the candle was also a source of fragile heat. A solitary wick couldn't heat an entire space, of course, but in an environment where every glimmer counted, even the faintest contribution mattered. Candles in the Middle Ages arrived in numerous forms. Prosperous households burned beeswax, which provided a clean, bright flame and filled the atmosphere with a faint honeyed aroma. These were expensive, reserved for chapels, ceremonies, or aristocratic chambers. More commonly, individuals used tallow candles created from rendered animal fat. These vapored, sputtered, and reeked of grease. Envision drifting off to rest while the acrid odor of burning tallow thickened the atmosphere, mingling with the moist of stone and the musk of wool. Yet candles weren't solely illumination. They generated a surprising amount of heat close by. Position one near your sleeping surface drapery, and you might observe the material heating slightly to the touch. Certain households arranged several candles together on stands, generating clusters of flames that offered both illumination and a pocket of heat. It was scarcely modern heating, but it softened the border of the cold in the immediate circle around them. An interesting anecdote survives from a 14th century letter characterizing how an aristocratic female demanded 12 candles in her chamber at once on winter evenings. Maintaining that solely then, could she rest? The attendants grumbled at the extravagance, but her request reveals a truth. Individuals used illumination as a substitute heater, even when the effect was marginal. The hazards were obvious. Candle flames toppled easily, and sleeping surface draperies rich with wool and linen were dangerously flammable. Documents characterize blazes sparked by careless placement, reducing complete chambers to cinders. One particularly grim tale from Germany informs of a squire who dozed off with a candle on the sleeping surface rail. He woke to discover his coverings aflame and scarcely escaped with his existence. The attendants blamed him for recklessness, but the genuine culprit was necessity. He had desired a sliver of heat too close at hand. Scholars continue discussing whether medieval individuals comprehended the dangers completely or whether the routine use of candles bred complacency. Certain contend that inventories of charred textiles demonstrate that accidents were common but accepted. Others believe the prosperous minimized risk by assigning attendants to monitor the illuminations deep into the evening. Whatever the case, the balance between danger and ease was persistent. Presently, envision yourself in such a chamber. The blaze in the hearth has dwindled to coals, leaving solely shadows crawling up the barriers. A solitary candle burns on a timber stand near your sleeping surface. Its radiance is gentle and golden, casting a halo that reaches your palms as you draw the coverings tighter. The faint heat radiates just enough that your face seems less frozen. The flame flickers, wax trickles steadily down the flank, and the aroma of vapor suspends faintly in the atmosphere. Beyond your drapery, the remainder of the space vanishes into obscurity. You listen to the subtle sounds, the quiet pop of the wick, the sigh of wind against the coverings, the gentle trickle of wax landing on metal. Your environment reduces to this small circle of illumination and heat. The candle becomes not merely illumination, but companionship, a fragile ally against the enormity of the evening. In cottages and inns, simpler versions of this scene played out. Travelers positioned rush illuminations, inexpensive reeds dipped in fat beside their straw pallets. These burned rapidly and unevenly, hissing and spitting, but their faint radiance provided reassurance. Parents illuminated small lamps near offspring to pursue away both cold and fear. Even monks who prized austerity permitted lamps to burn in dormitories, citing both safety and necessity. The sensory mixture was unforgettable. The atmosphere carried the aroma of melted fat and vapor, the barriers streaked with soot from months of burning, the bedcloth stained where wax had splattered. Yet individuals accepted these imperfections. In the harshest winter, the candle was more than embellishment. It was continuation. So as you drift beneath your own clean electric illumination this evening, envision the precarious flicker of a medieval flame. It heated just enough to trick the body into rest, and it risked disaster. With every spark, rest in the Middle Ages was never free from tension, even in the smallest details. To seal your vision was to trust that your fragile flame would burn through the evening without transforming heat into ruin. If you advance away from aristocratic chambers and into communal quarters, you discover another flank of medieval rest, the collective dormitory. Not everyone possessed the privilege of heavy draperies, feather sleeping surfaces, and private attendants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and attendants frequently rested in distributed areas where the emphasis was less on privilege and more on endurance. Consider the monastery as an example. Monastic regulations prescribed that brothers exist simply, which indicated their dormitories were enormous chambers lined with rows of sleeping surfaces or pallets. The stone ground extended perpetually, broken solely by confined openings high above. Each monk possessed his own small cot or straw sleeping surface, sometimes little more than a timber plank with a thin pad. The sleeping surfaces were positioned flank by flank, so close that one monk could detect the respiration of the next. Privacy was unknown, but heat originated from numbers. Surviving accounts characterize how these chambers echoed at evening with coughing, snoring, and the rustle of rough woolen coverings. The atmosphere was substantial, frigid, and moist, but the sheer press of bodies indicated the dormitory retained more heat than an isolated chamber ever could. One writer remarked that the cloister was heated than the ruler's tower, for the monks rested together like sheaves. In military existence, the scene was harsher still. Soldiers billeted in fortresses, or campaign encampments crowded into barrack chambers. Extended rows of warriors extended across straw sleeping surfaces, weapons stacked nearby. Coverings were distributed, and wraps doubled as covering. The aroma was pungent, perspiration, leather, vapor, and straw mingling in a stew of humanity. Yet, for the exhausted, even this rough camaraderie became bearable. To rest shoulder to shoulder was to survive the evening. An interesting observation appears in the regulations of certain knightly orders. Candles were maintained burning in communal chambers, not solely for illumination, but to ease the warriors with flame. The radiance provided a psychological heat, even if it failed to elevate the temperature significantly. The symbolism of the flame mattered as much as its heat. Historians proceed to debate whether communal resting was deliberately selected for heat or merely a byproduct of necessity. Certain contend that the monasteries intended it as a form of discipline, a persistent reminder that no monk possessed personal privilege. Others propose the heat of distributed area was a practical advantage that just happened to align with spiritual ideals. The identical ambiguity surrounds soldiers. Did they bunk together out of camaraderie or because the cold created solitude impossible? Likely it was both. Presently envision yourself resting in one of these chambers. The straw beneath you crackles as you shift. A neighbor coughs. Another rotates. The sound magnified by the vaulted ceiling. The aroma of vapor and perspiration suspends heavy, but the atmosphere is less biting than in a solitary chamber. Your wool covering scratches your chin, and you secure it tighter, appreciative for the distributed heat, even as you wish for quietness. The rhythm of the dormitory is unmistakable. Snores ascend and descend like waves, punctuated by the occasional murmur of a vision. Somewhere a rodent scurries across the rushes, ignored by warriors too weary to care. The current still seeps in through the high openings, but the collective body heat dulls its border. You may not sense comfortable, but you sense safe. Safer than you would alone in an enormous, echoing stone space. After the vapor, moist wool, and musty straw, another force assisted medieval individuals survive the evening: nourishment and beverage. You might not consider of supper as part of rest, but what you consumed before sleeping surface and what heat it provided inside your body mattered as much as any covering. In winter, households leaned on hearty, thick soups. Substantial stews of barley, peas, and root vegetables simmered gradually in magnificent cauldrons. These meals adhered to the body, leaving a heavy fullness that created the cold easier to bear. The heat of the broth persisted in the stomach, spreading outward, convincing you that you could endure a freezing chamber a little extended. An aristocratic household might enrich the dish with flesh, spices, or cream, while commoners relied on onions, cabbage, and whatever remnants were available. One interesting observation in a 15th century English manuscript advises consuming leeks at evening because they heat the belly and pursue away the freeze of death. Whether or not that claim maintained true, it demonstrates how intensely individuals linked diet with heat and continuation. A warm meal was not merely nourishment, it was insulation from the inside out. Beverages played an equally important role. Ale was the most common, consumed by rich and impoverished alike, served heated in winter. It filled bellies with calories and provided liquid ease. Spiced wine, or hippocras, became an aristocratic favorite, heated gently and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves imported from far lands. Envision sipping such a beverage in a vaporous chamber, the aroma of exotic spices mingling with wool and ash, the sweetness burning in your throat, leaving you drowsy and heated. There's even a document from the court of Charles VI of France where the monarch's physician recommended warm mead at evening to prevent freeze from entering the bones. The concept was not far from our contemporary habit of consuming tea before sleeping surface, though medieval science wrapped it in humoral theory. The belief that heated, moist beverages balanced the body's inner fluids. Scholars continue debating how much alcohol contributed to heat versus merely providing the impression of it. Certain contend that ale and wine dulled perception, creating sleepers believe they were heated than they were. Others indicate to the genuine caloric benefit of these beverages, which did provide energy through extended, frigid evenings. The reality may be somewhere in between, a mix of genuine heat and psychological ease. Presently, envision yourself preparing for sleeping service. An attendant hands you a timber cup of mulled wine. The surface steams, transmitting waves of spiced aroma into your nose. You consume, the liquid radiating as it slips down your throat. Your body relaxes, muscles loosening, eyelids heavy. When you ultimately ascend into sleeping surface, the coverings seem less oppressive, more inviting, as though the heat already exists inside you. For commoners, the ceremony was simpler, but no less important. A bowl of warm porridge, thickened with oats or barley, lined the stomach. Families pressed around the blaze to consume, their faces radiating in the illumination, their bodies fueled for the extended evening ahead. Offspring licked the final remnants from timber spoons before curling beneath coverings. The recollection of heat from nourishment assisted them ignore the currents, sneaking through the coverings. An interesting folk belief maintained that garlic, consumed before sleeping surface, prevented frostbite. Whether this was because garlic genuinely improved circulation or merely because it was heating to the palate, the habit endured. Farmers in frigid regions sometimes chewed cloves of garlic before resting down, the pungent aroma filling the chamber as intensely as vapor or wool. The sensory environment of medieval bedtime nourishment is vivid. The bubbling cauldron, the hiss of wine heating over the blaze, the aroma of herbs and spices mingling with moist rushes, the heavy weight of stew in the stomach. Every flavor was part of the battle against cold. So when you consider of medieval rest, do not separate it from the supper that arrived before. Nourishment was fuel, heat, and even a form of medicine. Without it, the cold was sharper, the coverings thinner, the evening extended. With it, the body endured. Every spoonful, every swallow was another stratum of defense, an inner covering, invisible but essential, against the freezing stone around you. Consider presently of the most vulnerable individuals inside a medieval fortress, the offspring and the elderly. Their bodies, less resilient to cold, frequently bore the burden of winter's cruelty. If a healthy adult warrior or attendant shivered through the evening, an offspring might wake blue-lipped, and an elderly female might not wake at all. Continuation for these groups depended on additional care, communal support, and sometimes sheer fortune. Household documents from aristocratic families demonstrate that offspring were seldom provided their own chambers. Instead, they rested in nurseries close to the heat of kitchens or clustered with attendants. Young pages and squires destined for training frequently bunked together in crowded spaces, their amusement and chatter dampened by coverings at evening. The logic was straightforward. More bodies indicated more heat. Infants, particularly, were swaddled in stratum after stratum of linen and wool. A cradle stood near the hearth, or in certain cases, directly inside the sleeping surface of the mother, where her body heat protected the infant from the freezing atmosphere. One poignant account from a 14th century chronicle characterizes an aristocratic offspring positioned by the blaze in a wicker crib, wrapped in animal skins, and covered with a canopy. The detail proposes the lengths families proceeded to safeguard their youngest. Yet even so, affliction and cold claimed numerous existences. Medieval parents existed with persistent fear that winter might take an offspring in the evening. The elderly confronted similar perils. Frail bodies produced less heat and tolerated fewer currents. In commoner cottages, grandparents frequently rested closest to the blaze, while younger adults accepted more frigid spots. In fortresses, aged relatives were positioned in smaller chambers or even shifted into kitchens during the most frigid months. An interesting letter from Burgundy informs of an elderly matron who maintained on resting in the bakehouse, contending that the oven's residual heat provided her a second youth. Medical writings of the era frequently advised special measures for the elderly and young. Physicians recommended heated stones wrapped in material to be positioned at their lower limbs, or mulled beverages to fortify the humors. They warned that sudden freezes could extinguish the flame of existence, a vivid reminder of how vulnerable these groups were. Historians proceed to discuss whether medieval families addressed offspring and elders with additional indulgence or merely folded them into the identical continuation tactics as everyone else. Certain contend that the emphasis on safeguarding them reflects deep compassion. Others indicate out that mortality rates remained high, proposing limits to what families could realistically accomplish. The tension between care and inevitability shaped how individuals viewed age and childhood. Presently envision the scene of a winter's evening in a commoner cottage. An infant rests swaddled tightly, his tiny face scarcely visible. A grandmother snores quietly by the hearth, the faint radiance of coals painting her face crimson. Parents secure wraps over both, ensuring they receive the most heated spots. Offspring crowd together on a straw sleeping surface, giggling until exhaustion silences them. The chamber carries the aroma of porridge, vapor, and wool, but the heat of family togetherness persists. In a fortress, the image is different, but no less vivid. A nursemaid rocks a cradle near the blaze, humming quietly, while an offspring whimpers against the freeze. Upstairs, an elderly, aristocratic female maintains her sleeping surface draperies be drawn secure, while an attendant positions warm stones at her lower limbs. She mutters prayers, clutching a rosary, fearful of the cold's advancing hand. In both environments, the youngest and oldest require the most attention, and sometimes even that isn't enough. The sensory detail is striking. The crackle of timber as they're added to the blaze, the gentle rustle of swaddling material, the wheeze of an elderly man adjusting beneath coverings. You sense the fragility in the atmosphere, as though the cold awaits for a moment of weakness to strike. So, when you consider of medieval rest, remember that it was not equal for all. Offspring and elders transported the heaviest risks, their continuation dependent on the heat provided by others. In those extended evenings, every covering, every coal, every whispered prayer mattered. They remind us that medieval rest was not solely about individual endurance, but about community. The young and elderly, transported through winter by the care and vigilance of those around them. Position for a moment by the confined opening of a medieval chamber at the height of winter, and you might witness something uncanny. Ice blooming on the inside barriers. Envision resting in sleeping surface and observing a delicate lace of ice tracing the stones, or waking to discover your wash basin frozen solid, the liquid inside transformed to a glassy block. The cold didn't remain politely outdoors. It invaded, embellishing spaces with its own cruel artistry. Writers document moments when complete households woke to ice on their sleeping surface draperies. One aristocratic female documented in a letter that her canopy glittered as though sewn with silver, indicating the moisture from her own exhalation had crystallized overnight. To us, it sounds poetic. To her, it was wretched proof of how inhospitable even a well-furnished chamber could be. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. In certain preserved fortresses, faint salt streaks and moisture stains propose how liquid condensed on barriers and grounds. Without insulation, heated indoor atmosphere met freezing stone, and ice took hold. Attendants scraped ice away in the mornings, solely for it to return each evening. An interesting anecdote survives from Scandinavia. In certain chambers, icicles developed on rafters indoors, trickling onto unlucky sleepers below. Attendants suspended materials to catch the meltwater, a primitive solution to an unnerving problem. Envision drifting off and detecting the faint crack of ice above, questioning if a shard would descend onto your sleeping surface. Scholars continue discussing how common this phenomenon was. Certain believe ice indoors was typical solely of Northern Europe, where winters were harsher. Others contend that even in temperate regions, inadequately heated stone chambers easily reached freezing temperatures. The reality may be both. Severity varied by region, but the risk of waking to ice inside your space was never far away. Presently, position yourself in that situation. You wake in the dim gray of dawn, exhalation fogging in the atmosphere. The sleeping surface draperies are rigid, bordered with frozen crystals. When you extend for the wash basin, your fingers touch ice instead of liquid. Your joints ache from the cold, and the consideration of departing the coverings seems like punishment. The sensory detail is vivid. The sharp sting of frozen material against your flesh, the brittle groan of timber shrunk by ice, the quietness broken solely by the faint trickle of melting ice. Commoners existed with the identical problem, though in different forms. In cottages, ice coated the inside of thatch and rafters, drifting down like snow during the evening. Offspring sometimes woke with ice adhering to their hair. Parents joked grimly about resting with the clouds indoors. Yet humor could not disguise the hardship. Frostbite, chilblains, and respiratory affliction pursued in its wake. Aristocrats, in spite of their prosperity, couldn't completely avoid it. Warm stones and animal skins maintained the body alive, but the surrounding atmosphere remained hostile. Diaries hint at the psychological toll. Individuals spoke of fearing the instant they had to depart sleeping surface in the morning, of sensing imprisoned by coverings, because the space beyond was too cruel to confront. One English poet even transformed it into metaphor, documenting of affection as a sleeping surface without ice inside the hangings. For him, true intimacy indicated defying the nightly freeze, generating heat where the environment offered solely ice. It reveals how deeply the encounter of ice shaped imagination as well as reality. So, as you consider of medieval rest, remember the surreal beauty of those evenings when cold embellished the very barriers. To exist in a fortress was to distribute your chamber with ice, to wake each morning reminded that stone and ice were allies against your ease. And yet, individuals endured, scraping ice away, stratifying coverings, murmuring prayers, and braving mornings that seemed as harsh indoors as out. The evening approaches its conclusion. Presently, allow the pace soften. Envision the coals radiating faintly, their illumination no extended fierce, but gentle, like coals resting after extended labor. The chamber is quiet, the rush of wind beyond the barriers fading to a far murmur. You sense the weight of coverings, heavy and protective, pressing you down into the sleeping surface. The struggle of cold, the vigilance of blazes, the noise of canines and attendants, all of it recedes as though you have drawn a drapery across the environment. Your respiration slows. Each inhale tastes faintly of vapor and wool. Each exhale drifts into the still atmosphere. The sounds that once echoed, boots on stone, coverings rattling, monks chanting, are presently recollections softened into murmurs. The fortress itself appears to rest, its stones maintaining quietness like a promise. Envision yourself safe within your shelter. The canine at your lower limbs sighs and shifts. The final candle flickers out, and obscurity folds around you like another covering. The cold is still there, yes, but you know extended battle it. You accept it as those before you did, understanding that rest is a fragile truce with the evening. Your body develops heavier. There is nothing more required of you now. The watch has been set. The draperies are drawn. The heated stones have given what warmth they carried. Whatever prayers were needed have been spoken into the stillness. Let the sounds dissolve. The distant bell has tolled. The footsteps on the rampart have grown quiet. Even the wind, that perpetual adversary, seems to have relented, dropping to a low murmur against the outer walls, as though it too has grown tired of the contest. Considerations dissolve into shapes and colors. The medieval environment, with all its freeze and vapor, becomes far, like ice melting in sunlight. What remains is solely calm. You are simply in the dark, in warmth, in rest. Your breath has found its natural depth. Your body has chosen stillness. The medieval night, with all its cold and ceremony and quiet endurance, passes gently through you like a dream already becoming indistinct. You are heated enough, safe enough, tired enough. And so the narrative seals. The hearth flickers, the sleeping surface maintains you, and the extended evening transports you gently into visions. Rest presently, as they once did, wrapped in quiet resilience, wrapped in the deep and patient dark that has always known how to hold a sleeping body until morning finds it again. Pleasant visions.